Hello and welcome to my latest Get a Life moment with myself, Lisa Davies. And today I am so very excited to be joined by the wonderful Dr. David Hamilton. Welcome, David.
Oh, thank you very much, Lisa. It's very kind of you. I'm really pleased to be here. First of all, thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. I'm so excited.
It's great. It's great. So we met some years ago, I think probably at a wellness or mind, body, spirit event.
Yep.
I'd followed you for many years. And I think you were there book signing. So David, for anybody who doesn't know, and I'll let him tell his own story of how he got to be where he is an amazing author. Former and still scientist, because he's Dr. David Hamilton. And so, yeah, we met. I think I was probably book signing myself at the time, maybe. And I've watched you and listened to you speak so many times, and a true inspiration in the health, well-being world, I would say. So, yeah, I'm so excited. So, kind of to start us off, for anybody who maybe hasn't come across your work before, who is Dr. David Hamilton?
Well, I live in, I think the accent gives it away, but I live in Scotland. I live in a wee town called Dunblane, which is in central Scotland. It's in between Glasgow and Edinburgh, very famous for tennis. We have a thriving tennis community. I play tennis myself, thanks to Andy Murray, Jamie Murray and Judy Murray.
Yeah,
all of whom have hailed from Dunblane. Judy still pops by every time she passes the court. She always waves and stuff.
That's your claim to fame. Is that just a little bit of name dropping in there?
No. I just, I really like the Murrays. I think they're really lovely people, and it's them and others have helped to build a really thriving tennis community in Dunblane. So that's what I do with a lot of my free time. Actually, is I play tennis because the courts are just like down the road from where I live, so I play most days at lunchtime during my lunch break. But to broaden your question, so formally, well, I have a PhD in organic chemistry, which is nothing to do with organic food, incidentally. It's like, or organic chemistry is like playing with Lego blocks. But you know the way children take Lego blocks of different shapes and sizes and colors, and they can stick them together and assemble a variety of shapes, like a car, a rocket ship, or a house or something. So an organic chemist is exactly the same, but instead of using plastic or wooden building blocks, I use atomic building blocks. So a child's green block is my carbon, a child's blue block is my nitrogen, but the idea is the same. But instead of assembling rocket ships and buildings, I would assemble medicines. Right. And so I was a research and development scientist with a really large pharmaceutical company. But after a few years, my fascination became the placebo effect, and recognizing a large amount of people who would make some form of improvement in a medical trial on a placebo. And so I started to research, what's happening there. At the time, the conventional wisdom, even among my senior colleagues, the conventional wisdom was, and I thought this myself at first because we didn't know any better, is that it was just the natural course. If someone got better on a placebo, it was just the natural course of their illness. But I realized that couldn't actually be true. So I started to look into that and research it, and turned out discovering that there was research showing that when you, like, so for example, get a placebo that you think is a painkiller, your brain actually produces its own version of morphine.
So
and that's what reduces
chemical reaction in the body. Change.
So belief that this is a painkiller, even though it's a placebo, and an expectation that my pain will reduce, is a physical change in the brain, where your belief or your expectation causes the brain to generate its own version of morphine, which reduces the pain. So it's not just the natural course of things, that there is a biochemical change in the brain that follows what the person believes. And that for me was like a light bulb. Isn't this amazing? There's actually hard science that begins to validate, stuff that many people have always, because I always had an interest in this sort of stuff. My mum had postnatal or postpartum depression after my youngest sister was born in the mid-70s. And so my mum benefited from what we call woo-woo thing. My mum benefited from meditation practices and affirmations and stuff. So my mum and I often then, and even still do now, have conversations about this kind of stuff. So when I ended up as an R&D scientist, as well as enjoying the research and development, because it's a fascinating subject, manipulating the structure of atom molecules and stuff, I couldn't help but be drawn to understanding why was the mind, what was the impact of the mind, because it had been so beneficial to my mum. So that's really what brought me to this.
Fascinating, isn't it? So I guess you left behind your R&D sort of role in a large pharmaceutical company, and you were out in the big world. And kind of where did it go from there? How did you actually then sort of move more into the woo-woo side of the world?
Well, do you know, Lisa, I had no idea how to do what I'm doing now. It was my dream. I wanted to write books and educate people on how to harness mind and emotions to improve their health. But I really didn't know what I was doing. And to be honest, my very first speaking event, it cost me, almost all of my money. And I took in, I think at the time I spent like over £1,000 putting this event together, and I took in 40. So I was out £960 in my first event. I canceled them a week later. I had another event scheduled, which I cancelled because I'd spent even more and had no bookings at all. So in a very short space of time, I was absolutely broke, to be honest. And it's because this was before social media. I didn't even have a website. I advertised in the Big Issue, and I just didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea. It seemed like that's what I needed to do. And then a few friends and I got together one day, and we created a charity to help children whose lives had been affected by war and poverty. We called it Spirit Aid Foundation. It's still thriving today.
I've done work with Spirit Aid Foundation. I've actually used to raise money for them because an old friend and therapist who used to work with me was very heavily involved.
Well, I was one of the founding members of that back in 2001. And we generated the very first festival, and that was really great. And for me, that was almost a kind of learning and growing up experience, because when I was in the pharmaceutical industry, everything was done for me. And what I mean by that is, if I wanted to give a presentation, I just went to human resources and they booked a room and, got the audience there, kind of thing. And everything was easy, everything, there was a structure. And when I went out into the world, I didn't really know how the world worked, I've got to phone a venue and book it myself.
You don't have a marketing director to do it for you.
And I've got to write a check and pay for this. And what's an invoice? I've never seen an invoice in my life. I've never handled an invoice. And I've got to, they're going to invoice me and I have to invoice you. And I had no idea. But during that time, I was like a director of the charity, and I had to learn quick. I became the finance director, I was the IT director, I had to learn everything, you name it. And that was my growing up period. So when I left after a couple of years to go off in my own way, I had learned a bit about the world. And I took a job I took a couple of jobs. I was a chemistry lecturer for a year, and I taught ecology as well and tutored maths. And that was all my growing up period. And during that time, I was writing my first book. Which was really the reason why I left the pharmaceutical industry in the first place. So by the time I self-published my first book, I actually was almost 5 years out of the pharmaceutical industry. It took me a long time to find my way in the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and you've not looked back since. You fill rooms now and people can't wait.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, you do. I've been there. I've seen it for real. So, it's interesting that you should say about the sort of like the placebo effect, because we're going to come on to talking about your latest book, Why Woo Woo Works, in a moment. But I was having a discussion with my future son-in-law, who is a specialist nurse. So he's very much on the clinical side of things, where I'm on the woo-woo side of things. But we do meet in this middle ground, because he actually did part of his dissertation for his degree on the placebo and the nocebo effect. So we had a real good dialogue about your latest book. But for everybody else who hasn't read it yet, tell us about your latest work, which is Why Woo Woo Works.
Well, I happen to have a copy just here.
I'm glad you do, because mine's on my Kindle. That was the quickest way I could get it.
Well, do you know what? That I wrote it. That what was pushing through all of the narrative right through the whole book was I've seen so many people in the mainstream medicine who completely reject any alternative and complementary therapies, and it's just all rubbish to them. And yet I've seen many people in the opposite extreme so far into it's all mind and alternative and stuff, and would never touch anything over here.
Yeah.
And there's such a polarity, and it's a polarity that we see so often in different ways in the world. And I've always felt that there's something to be gained from middle ground. Maybe I've always been a bit of a peacemaker. And so what I did with the book is I tried to show these people over here, there's a lot of stuff in the middle here, and these people over here, there's a lot of stuff here, and show that there's a lot, you know, I suppose I do call it a kind of middle ground. I've always believed a fusion of the ideas. Sometimes there's a case for saying, well, we need more of this, like 80% of this and 20% of that. Yeah. But other times it would actually be better with 80% of that and 20% of that. And other times maybe a kind of happy medium. That really depends on the person, and it depends on the condition, and it depends on the context. But certainly I've always believed, especially when I worked in the pharmaceutical industry and started to see the benefits of alternatives, and I've seen that so many times. You know, I've taught in cancer centers about the mind-body connection, where people who are going through mainstream treatment come and also receive Reiki. Yes. Or massage, or reflexology, or learn how to meditate and stuff. And it helps them so much. And what they're receiving is a fusion of these two worlds. And I'd always, for years, I thought I would love to write about that fusion and say, let's take the best of the West, but the best of all the rest, and put it together and walk this path together as friends. And let's stop, you know, being so polarized and say there's so much in the middle, so much common ground. Let's celebrate what we all can benefit from. Yeah. And so in the book, I picked subjects that people often deride it as woo-woo, and show there's actually a heck of a lot of, I called it surprising science, because some of it took me by surprise actually when I started researching it. And I covered like a whole spectrum from the lower end of woo-woo, as I call it, where at least some people have an idea that there's definitely something in it. For example, the placebo effect and how it works. How does belief actually cause changes in the brain? How does that actually work? To meditation. But then I kind of move, and even trauma. How can trauma show up as illness later in life? How does that kind of work? And then I move into kind of middle ground woo-woo, like how nature itself, the experience of nature, has impacts on our nervous system, Reiki, crystals. Then I move into kind of higher end of woo-woo, like research into prayer and distant healing and consciousness, and really explore all these kind of ideas. And show that there's a lot to be had there, and we don't need to just do that instead of that, or just that instead of that, but there's a whole bunch of really cool stuff in the middle that can help all of us, I think.
I think that I'm speaking as a therapist myself. And for me, I think the future's got to be integrated medicine. It's got to be integrated. If you go to the Far East, that is the way that they do things. You know, if you go into a Chinese hospital, you'll see Chinese herbalists and an acupuncturist and a mainstream allopathic consultant. Yeah. So that's the way that things work there. But I think we're just moving towards a more integrated approach in some cases, which I think has got to be the way forward, hasn't it? But I think it's one of these books that everybody should read it. I don't know if you ever saw the film The Connection, and after I saw that, everybody should see it. And this is the same feeling with this book. I feel like everybody should read it because it opens up so much debate and discussion. The bit that you said there about nature, I just finished reading the chapter around the effects of nature on us. And with my hubby, when I've not got my therapist hat on, we run heartfelt leadership retreats for corporate, big global companies. And we run those in ancient woodlands. And there's something really magical about that. And, you get CEOs, MDs, senior leaders coming along, and they just kind of fall into this space of nature. It's the training room is a cob-built, rammed earth round building, and they just fall into that space, and they're just so much more open and receptive to the learning than they would be if they were working in their own offices or in an artificially lit training room. And so that then opened up a whole dialogue between myself and my husband about, there's something really powerful. We know there's something really powerful about taking people into nature to do what we do. But actually, just look at this, look at the science that David's writing about that confirms all the stuff that we intuitively knew but couldn't verbalize or rationalize.
Absolutely. Lisa, in the whole span of evolution of the human species, our ancestors, our pre-human ancestors, we have spent 99.99% of our time in natural surroundings, so around trees and grass and the sounds of birds and crickets and animals and running water. We've spent 99.99% of our time in natural surroundings. Only 0.01% of our time in among grey blocky buildings with glass windows in them. So over eons of evolution, compared with the levels of stress that most humans live under nowadays, relatively speaking, our ancestors lived in relative calm. So what happened over thousands of years, evolution, is that state of relative calm where the nervous system was relaxed became correlated with the what was being experienced at the time. So in other words, in the human psyche and in the nervous system and in the body, that state of calm became correlated with seeing and hearing nature itself. So nowadays, the moment a person even sees nature or hears nature, the nervous system begins to respond, and it goes like that, and it starts moving towards what's called parasympathetic dominance, which is a restorative experience. So the stress response goes down, and the body begins to heal. It begins to go into an optimum state of rest and relaxation and optimum recovery all by itself. And that's why you find, I cited some of this research in the book, that hospital patients whose window offers them a view of nature, like trees and buildings and hills and stuff, mountains, forests, recover faster in their mental and physical health than people who have an identical room, but their window offers them a brick wall like another hospital building or a car park.
Or that you have plants in that space as well. That was the other thing.
Even bringing plants into this space.
I was discussing with my future son-in-law, and he was like, yes, it's so true. It's so true. But it's just starting dialogues with people that, whether you are on the woo-woo side, whether you're on the clinical side, or you're just in between and don't know about this stuff, start to talk to somebody who has never experienced Reiki or worked with crystals or reflexology, yeah, but how does that work then? So it's really interesting that actually, if they could just read this book, just read this book, it's not as woo-woo as it sounds.
What I tried to do is show scientifically why all these things work and how they work, and show that rather than it being woo-woo, I call it true-woo. There really is all actually, there's a lot of truth in all of this kind of stuff. So I couldn't do every subject in the world because the book would become so large. So I picked subjects that, after talking to a lot of people, these were the ones that people most wanted answers to. So there's a big chapter on Reiki, there's a big chapter on crystals, there's a chapter on meditation, nature, there's chapters on prayer and distant healing, consciousness, even the law of attraction. I've got a chapter on that. So it was really just within this constraints you have with the thickness of book that you don't want to make a book too big. It's 80,000 words. So you can't make it too big. So within those constraints, I chose the subjects that most people wanted answers to. But also subjects that would therefore the same reasoning would apply to a large number of other things. Like chapter on Reiki, when I explained how it works, the same could also be said for things like therapeutic touch and Joe Ray and Biora and many other type therapies that don't even rely on hands-on, but where a practitioner comes into close contact with a client, regardless of what therapy they do. I explain why how the degree of empathy or compassion that a therapist feels will actually influence regardless of what therapy they do. And this even applies in a doctor's consulting room. This even applies.
So interesting.
This even applies in a ward when there's a nurse or a consultant there. It applies in every context. The more empathy that the practitioner or doctor or nurse shows, the greater likelihood it is that that person will get better. In fact, studies on empathy showed that when doctors showed it, people were covertly asked to fill out a questionnaire on how much empathy the doctor had showed when they turned up with symptoms of the common cold. And over a couple of years, over 700 people filled out the questionnaire. You know, those who scored the doctor a perfect 10 to 10 in empathy, their immune response was about 50% higher than everyone else's, and they recovered about 50% faster. And
it doesn't surprise me, but it's to have that backed up with data is just brilliant, isn't it?
In continental European studies of males with prostate cancer, almost a few hundred men, when they scored their doctor high in empathy, even 3 months later, they had higher levels of natural killer cells in their blood than people whose doctor showed them less empathy. I mean, isn't that extraordinary?
Oh, it's amazing.
So you bring empathy. Like empathy really means I feel with you.
Yeah.
So I'm not thinking of what I'm going to say next. I'm not here to just pretend that I'm listening to you. I'm fully here with you. I'm listening. I hear you. I see you. I hear you. I'm listening. That level of empathy, that is absolutely correlated with putting the other person, their nervous system, into a restorative mode. And before anything else is said or done, the person, their body itself begins to rejuvenate because you're listening, you're giving them that empathetic space, whether you're a Reiki practitioner or a crystal healer or a reflexologist, or whether you're a nurse or a GP or a consultant. It applies in every single context. If you really care and show that you're listening and seeing the person, the body begins to move into a restorative experience all by itself.
It reminds me of a couple of things. Several years ago, I did a big training course. Well, I ran some training for some junior doctors down in London. And it was all on sort of understanding communication through different personality types and different interactions, and the results that they got by really understanding who was in front of them and what that particular patient really needed from them. And it was so fascinating. Those that were more high on the sort of people empathy scale were getting a much better response from their patients, to those that were much more analytical and task based were not getting that same response in their outcomes. So it was really interesting really interesting that you should say that. But also just picking up on that being seen and heard. You know, anybody who's ever been on any of our leadership retreats, I'll say that it's my personal belief that as human beings, fundamentally, we want to be seen, heard and loved, or maybe in a business setting, seen, heard and appreciated. But there's science behind that now to say that empathy that is between two humans is so powerful.
Absolutely. And it also has immense cardiovascular benefits for the person who's showing empathy as well, because empathy generates that sense of bonding, and that stimulates the production of what I call kindness hormones.
Yes.
You know, the main kindness hormone is also called the love drug, the hugging hormone, the cuddle chemical oxytocin.
Yeah.
But it has tremendous, it's a cardiovascular hormone as well as just a bonding hormone. It lowers blood pressure. It also keeps the blood vessels clear of the precursors to cardiovascular disease itself. So being the one sharing empathy, being the empathy one, is actually very good for you as well.
Yeah.
You know,
so we've got to be compassionate and empathetic to everyone around us, as well as ourselves.
As well as to ourselves as well, 100%.
So to coin another one of your words, kindness is good for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Kindness is good for you. Absolutely. It's one of the 5 side effects of kindness, as I call it in one of my other books.
Yeah. Fantastic. I mean, for anybody who, I'm sure lots of people watching this will have read many of your books, know about your work, but for anybody who hasn't, I mean, there's just a plethora, a juicy collection of information that can be gleaned from your work. I mean, it's just amazing that you bring it to the world and put it into language that, you know, everybody can access, you know, meaningful way that everybody can access.
Oh, thanks, Lisa. That's very kind of you.
So obviously now why Woo Woo Works is out there in the world. You've delivered that baby to the world. What's next? What are you working on next, David?
I'm not so much. I've got two main things that I'm doing. Like, I've always been a passionate believer in kindness can change the world. So I will continue through my social media platforms to keep pushing out, not just explaining how Woo Woo works, because I've been writing lots of articles, doing lots of videos over the next year or so, but pushing out lots of explanations and facts about how kindness makes a difference to our mental health, physical health, how it can change the world. At the same time, I'm also in the latter stages of a university degree. I've been doing part-time in mathematics and physics.
Just on the side.
Yeah, I've been doing it for the last 4 years.
Yeah.
And it's a fair bit amount of work. It's funny, I had a mathematics exam, you know, with things like, you know, vector calculus and all that kind of stuff. I had a mathematics exam on the same day as my book editorial deadline for Why Woo Woo Works. It was a tough few months of scrambling to get the book finished and also finding the time to study for a really tough maths exam.
You're talking to somebody who doesn't have enough fingers and toes to add up here, by the way. I just put that out there.
No, I absolutely love the maths and physics. You know, one of the reasons I'm doing it actually is because I would like to touch on subjects further down the line. Because for me, writing books is I'm in this for the long haul. I can't imagine not doing this. I can't imagine not educating and finding fascinating stuff and writing about it that can help people. I can't imagine not doing that.
Yeah.
And so I see myself in the future maybe exploring subjects where I need a bit more in-depth knowledge. And because I had been looking at parallels between the Buddhist theory of relativity, which is very similar to Einstein's theory of relativity. What it really means is everything only exists in relation to something else. So for example, up only exists in relation to down. Yeah. An object only exists in relation to another object.
Yeah.
But if you track that all the way back, you get back to the point where happiness only exists in the context of sad, or sadness only exists in the context of the absence of sadness. So what the Buddhist theory of relativity or dependent origination is really teaching is how to find inner peace by removing all relativity. Now, Einstein's theory of relativity in physics does exactly the same, but it's a physical theory. And I was starting to explore that, and that can be tracked all the way back to the quantum level. And I was looking at that, playing with that idea, rolling that around as a possible future book. And I thought, I just don't know the subject well enough, and I wouldn't want to misrepresent it because it's quite a tough subject. So I thought, well, the best way to really get my head around that is to do a full honours degree in it, but with a fusion of mathematics and physics. So could dive into the mathematical physics essentially, and that's what I've been doing, and it's been great education. I've been so enjoying it.
Because so that's a really tough piece of work to do. I mean, I'm old enough to have done O-levels. I'll just put it out there. And I did O-level physics and thought that was mind-bending. So hats off to you.
Well, I really love it. So far, I've done quite well. My first 4 years, I've managed distinctions all the way through.
Fantastic.
So I'm really pleased that I think, I don't mean that, I'm not trying to impress anyone, really just to impress upon you that the difference, when I got a first in chemistry, like, 30 years ago or something, nearly 30 years ago, no, 25 years ago or so. But back then I was trying to get a first. And so you're working towards getting a certain percentage. Whereas now, I actually couldn't care less about the mark I get. Now it's, I want to understand.
Yeah.
I want to understand, how does that work? And so my motivation isn't just to get a certain mark, it's to understand. So I don't ever want to be in a situation where I'm going to sit an exam and there's something I don't understand. because what's the point in doing the subject? I'm doing the subject because I want to know. So my marks are significantly way above what they were when I was at mainstream. We call it bricks and mortar university, because I've done the last, I've not had a live tutorial in 18 months because it's been during COVID. So for me, it's I want to understand the line, because mathematics, as it applies to physics, is really just the physical version of philosophy, which underpins law and reasoning itself. And mathematics is really just a geometrical version of philosophy. And I so love it. It's like a language of nature itself, and it really overlaps so well with what I'm doing, talking about mind-body connection, consciousness, kindness, why woo-woo works. It all really ties in together. It's just different ways of explaining the same thing, and I just love it all.
The patterns and how it all fits together. It's making me feel very inspired. I've been in the background working on another book that I've just not got round to doing yet, but it's about inspiration. I don't want to give it all away, because somebody might go away and write it, but that's fine, because it needs to be in the world. Why some people have that spark of inspiration and do something with it, and why others don't. And what is inspiration? Is it divinely guided? Are you hardwired in your DNA? Is it a critical life event that happens that then sparks you into action? And so I kind of want, it's that needing to understand what causes that to either turn into something or not turn into something. But I feel quite inspired listening to you talking there.
Yeah, good for you.
Back up. I'm going to do that.
Good for you, Lisa.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So I'm going to spring this one on you, because I didn't mention this before, but with everybody that I interview, I invite them to share with the audience what would be your top tip for life. Now, I am really throwing you on this because I've not mentioned it before, but if you were to give somebody a top tip for life, what might it be?
Be kind.
Be kind.
Let it simply be kind. Kindness it's like glue that binds relationships together, that binds societies together. It's that which connects us in all ways, really, and it's highly contagious as well, funnily enough.
Yeah.
But I think kindness, when you make a decision, when you decide, I'm going to try to be kind, not just in what I do, but also in what I say, and in what I think, how I think about people. Cutting people some slack sometimes, and just trying to see the best in people. I think if more of us did that, I think we could solve a lot of difficulties and challenges we have in our personal lives and organizations. If organizations put kindness on the table, let's create a culture of kindness, which I've been doing a lot of talks in corporates about kindness, and many companies now are putting that on the agenda. How do we create a culture of kindness? Oftentimes it starts with promoting empathy. How do we become more empathetic? That kind of thing. So I would say be kind. That would be my top tip, and it will solve so many problems that you might encounter in your life. I mean, kindness is always in fashion, but now we need it more than ever. We've gone through a period of staying at home where there was huge amounts of kindness displayed. Actually, I saw in that first staying at home that there was huge amounts of kindness displayed in communities, to people on the front line, and I think more recently, in the last week, with people fighting on forecourts over petrol, there is kind of this division in so many areas of our life. You see it on social media, you see it in the news, that kindness has got to be the answer, hasn't it? It's got to be the answer. Absolutely. Well, it's been my absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much for joining me, David. It's been fantastic. I feel truly inspired. And I'm going to put all the links so people can go out there and buy Why Woo Woo Works and read all about the amazing stuff that you've got in there, because it's definitely one everybody should read. So thanks so much. Thank you so much, Lisa. That's very kind of you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much for inviting me on to your podcast. It's been a real joy to have this wee conversation.
Brilliant. Great to see you.
And you too.